The dim light from the living room cast soft shadows on the walls as a gentle breeze slipped through the cracked window. Victoria Hayes sat motionless in the oversized armchair, her hand lazily swirling a half-empty glass of red wine. Her gaze was fixed on the dark, sprawling night beyond the glass panes. The streetlights outside shimmered like distant stars, but to her, they were nothing more than pale glimmers, devoid of warmth or meaning. In the distance, the muffled giggles of her 2 children floated down from upstairs. Normally, such sounds might have filled her with joy, but tonight, they only weighed heavier on her chest. Andrew, her husband, sat on the floor with them, his voice carrying through the walls, warm, steady, and reassuring like an anchor holding the family together. Yet instead of grounding her, it only made her feel more adrift, as though the connection she once felt was slipping further out of reach. Lifting the glass to her lips, Victoria sipped the wine, the tartness lingering on her tongue. She glanced down at the wedding ring glinting softly on her finger, the light catching the polished surface as if to remind her of the promises it once symbolized. Those vows, those words that had made her heart flutter with hope, now felt like chains tethering her to a life that had grown stifling. "He hasn't changed," she muttered, her voice barely audible, thick with suppressed emotion. "It's me who's different." The sound of quiet footsteps behind her jolted her from her thoughts. Andrew entered the room, a steaming mug of tea in hand, his eyes as gentle as ever as they settled on her. He paused briefly, observing her before placing the mug on the nearby table. "You're not going upstairs with the kids?" he asked, his voice light as a whisper. But there was something else in his tone, something beneath the surface. A subtle hesitation, as if he knew more than he let on. "No, I just needed a little quiet," she replied, forcing a faint smile that barely reached her eyes. The weariness in her expression betrayed her effort. Andrew nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than usual before he turned to leave. Just as he reached the doorway, he stopped, his voice quieter now, almost tentative. "Vicky, are you okay?" The simplicity of his question struck a chord deep within her, cutting through the wall of unease she had built around herself. She drew a sharp breath, placing her wineglass on the table as she met his eyes. "Andrew, have you ever felt like you're living a life you didn't choose?" He turned back, his brow furrowing slightly as he tried to make sense of her words. "What do you mean?" Victoria wanted to say it all, to lay bare the storm of emotions swirling inside her, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she shook her head and replied, "It's nothing. Just a passing thought." Andrew didn't press her further, but the way his eyes searched hers made her feel exposed. Finally, he gave a small nod and left the room, his footsteps fading into the quiet of the house. As the silence settled in, Victoria let out a long, shaky breath, her head bowing as her hands clenched around the wineglass. She didn't notice that, from the shadows of the staircase, Andrew had stopped and was quietly watching her, his expression a mix of doubt and unease. She had no idea that tonight, a conversation would take place that would irrevocably alter the course of their marriage, steering them both toward paths neither of them wanted to tread. Closing her eyes, Victoria leaned back in the armchair, and the memories came flooding back, unbidden and vivid, like a film reel rewinding through the years. The dim glow of the room seemed to soften as her mind drifted to the days when her love for Andrew was as full and alive as the morning sun, unburdened by the weight of time or the responsibilities that now consumed them. She could see it so clearly, that crisp autumn afternoon on the college campus where they first met. Andrew had been a bundle of energy and enthusiasm, his eyes alight with dreams of the future. He had pursued her with an unwavering determination, his honesty and radiant smile breaking down every wall she had built around herself. Back then, Victoria had been a young woman full of dreams, swept away by the steady confidence he exuded, by the way he made her feel secure in a world that often felt chaotic and uncertain. She remembered the day he proposed, the image burned into her memory like a photograph. There were no extravagant gestures or grand displays, just him, kneeling in the middle of an open field on the outskirts of the city where they often went on weekends. The autumn breeze tousled her hair as he looked up at her, his gaze a mixture of vulnerability and resolve. "I don't have much, Vicky," he had said, his voice low and sincere. "But I have this love, and I promise you'll never feel alone." Those words had been her anchor, her beacon, and for many years he had kept that promise. Their early days were filled with simplicity and joy, their laughter ringing out as they cooked together in their tiny first apartment, their quiet weekends by the lake where she sketched designs while he read aloud from his favorite books. Their love had once been like a flowing stream, clear and refreshing, weaving its way through the rocks of life's challenges. But, like an unexpected storm, life began to change. The arrival of their children brought immeasurable happiness, but also a weight neither of them had anticipated. Andrew buried himself in work, striving to provide for their growing family, while Victoria found herself consumed by the endless demands of motherhood. She gave up her career as an interior designer, a dream she had once pursued with relentless passion, to dedicate herself fully to the role of a mother. The long days within the same four walls, the cries of restless children, and the silence that greeted her when Andrew returned home late at night all began to chip away at her sense of self. She remembered the nights when she lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering when the vibrant, passionate woman she used to be had become a shadow of herself. And every time she looked at Andrew, she wondered if he even noticed. Victoria opened her eyes, her chest heavy with the weight of these memories. Somewhere deep inside, she knew that her longing for something more wasn't about Andrew. It was about the part of herself she had lost along the way. But she couldn't shake the feeling that tonight would set something into motion, something she could no longer control. One night, Victoria sat alone in the living room, the dim glow of the table lamp highlighting the fine lines of worry etched on her face. Her wineglass trembled slightly in her hand as she replayed Andrew's words in her mind. He had held her just weeks before, his voice a soft whisper in her ear. "We just need to get through this phase. Everything will be fine, I promise." But that phase had stretched into years, and with it, the distance between them had grown like a chasm. She remembered waking up one night, the house enveloped in silence. Turning her head, she looked at Andrew, his face peaceful in sleep but unfamiliar. She had stared at him, trying to reconcile the man she married with the stranger beside her. When did I lose him? She thought, her heart heavy with a question she couldn't answer. The last memory of true sweetness between them made her throat tighten. It was 5 summers ago, back when life hadn't yet weighed them down. They had taken the kids camping by the lake, laughing and playing as if the world outside didn't exist. Andrew had lifted her into his arms like he used to when they were young, spinning her around while their children laughed until their bellies ached. She could still see the way he had smiled at her then, a smile she hadn't seen in years. Victoria blinked, the wineglass steadying in her grip as the weight of her memories bore down on her. She wondered if Andrew ever noticed how she too was slipping away. Or did he still see her as the same young woman he married, satisfied with what she had? She drew a deep breath, trying to push away the tide of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. But the emptiness lingered, and so did the longing for something she couldn't even name. Those unfulfilled desires had brought her to this moment, and deep down, she knew that the door she was about to open would change everything forever. The next morning, the sky mirrored her mood, gray and heavy with an unshakable gloom. Light rain tapped against the kitchen window as the steady hum of the coffee maker filled the quiet. Victoria sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, her gaze distant as she replayed a conversation from the day before. "You're wasting the last of your youth, Vicky," Cassie had said, her sharp, piercing eyes locking onto Victoria's like a blade. "Men always have time to reclaim their freedom. Women don't. Think about it. 15 years you've spent living for Andrew and the kids. When will it be your turn to live for yourself?" Those words stuck in Victoria's mind like a thorn. She had smiled weakly at Cassie then, brushing off the comment, insisting that her family was her everything. But when she returned home that night, sitting through another silent dinner and seeing Andrew's gentle yet distant gaze, she realized Cassie might be right. For so many years she had lived for Andrew, for her children. And what about herself? Where had her dreams gone? That sense of emptiness didn't fade when Andrew came home later that night. He walked in, set his briefcase down, and gave her a small smile. A smile that felt more like an obligation than an expression of love. He asked how her day was, nodded a few times, and then pulled out his phone to check work emails. Victoria saw it clearly now. Andrew was here, but he hadn't been present in a long time. The entire Sunday passed in a fog of tension. Victoria busied herself with small tasks, but an unshakable weight hung over her. She knew something was coming. That evening after dinner, she decided she couldn't wait any longer. As the kids went upstairs, she turned to Andrew, her heart pounding as she prepared to say the words that would change everything. "Andrew, I need to talk to you," she said, her voice steady but fragile. He looked up from his newspaper, his brows knitting together slightly in curiosity, but he didn't object. He nodded, poured 2 glasses of wine, and sat across from her at the dining table. "What's on your mind, Vicky?" She took a deep breath, each inhale feeling heavier than the last. "Are you happy?" she asked, her eyes scanning his face for a flicker of recognition, of understanding. "With our life?" He looked momentarily caught off guard by the question, then shrugged. "We have a good family, 2 amazing kids, a nice home. I'd say that's enough to be happy." "And me," she began, her voice faltering. "I feel empty, Andrew. I love you, but I don't know if that's enough anymore." The room fell silent, the weight of her confession hanging between them like a storm cloud. Andrew stared at her, his expression shifting from confusion to concern, and then to something she couldn't quite place. She saw a flash of unease in his eyes, but he stayed quiet, waiting for her to continue. "I've been talking to Cassie," she admitted, her gaze dropping to her wine glass. "She made me realize that sometimes we need something more than marriage to feel alive." Andrew set his glass down, his hands clasping tightly in front of him, his jaw tightening as he processed her words. "What exactly are you saying, Vicky?" "I think—" She hesitated, her throat tightening as her heart pounded. "I think we should try an open marriage." Her words dropped like a heavy stone into the stillness of the room. Andrew's eyes widened, disbelief and anger flashing across his face. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice low and cold, sharper than she had ever heard it. "Andrew, I don't want to hurt you," she said quickly, her words tumbling out. "But I feel stuck. I need freedom. I need to feel wanted. Something I haven't felt in a long time." "Then what am I, Vicky?" His voice rose, and for the first time in years she saw real anger in his expression. "Am I just a placeholder? A backdrop for your unfulfilled fantasies? We made vows, for God's sake. Vows to stay faithful. And now you want to erase that because you're bored?" "It's not boredom," she shot back, her voice breaking. "I don't want a divorce, Andrew. I still love you. I just think this might save our marriage." He laughed bitterly, the sound cutting through her like glass. "Save our marriage? By letting you run off with other men while I sit here and wait for you to come back? That's your idea of saving this?" Victoria felt her heart tighten, but she didn't back down. She had come too far to turn back now. "Just give it a chance," she pleaded. "We can set boundaries. You can try it too." Andrew stared at her as if seeing her for the first time, his eyes filled with something unrecognizable, disappointment, hurt, and a trace of fury. After what felt like an eternity, he rose from his seat, his wine glass trembling in his hand. "I need time," he said, his voice cold and clipped. "I can't look at you right now." As the door slammed shut behind him, Victoria sat frozen, feeling as though she had just destroyed something irreparable. Yet she told herself she had no regrets. Or at least, she thought she shouldn't have any. But Victoria couldn't enjoy it. The initial thrill of her dates with James, the young colleague who had eagerly pursued her, quickly faded. Each night spent in a hotel room and every sweet message he sent only deepened the void inside her. James was too young, too naive to understand the loneliness of a woman trying to piece herself back together. Instead of filling the emptiness, he only made her more aware of its depth. Meanwhile, Andrew grew increasingly distant. He no longer asked where she went on her late nights out, nor did he try to intervene. He simply retreated into silence, pouring himself into work, gym sessions, and dinner with their children. Yet, that silence, far from providing relief, pressed down on her like an unbearable weight, making her feel as though she were suffocating under its enormity. Everything came to a head one weekend evening. Victoria returned home after a night out with Cassie to find the kitchen light still on. Confused, she walked in, and the sight stopped her cold. Andrew was sitting at the table, a half-empty bottle of wine between him and a woman she didn't recognize. The woman had long brown hair, a calm smile, and an air of familiarity about her that sent a sharp pang through Victoria's chest. The way the woman looked at Andrew, intimate yet composed, felt like a knife twisting in her gut. "Victoria," Andrew said, his tone unnervingly calm. "This is Emily, an old friend of mine." Victoria froze. She had heard Emily's name mentioned a few times in the past, but had never met her. Before, she hadn't thought much about Andrew's friends, but at this moment, every instinct she had screamed at her to pay attention. "Hello," Emily greeted, her voice warm yet confident. "Andrew's told me a lot about you." Victoria forced a stiff smile, though unease was coursing through her veins. "Really? I didn't realize Andrew still kept in touch with old friends." Andrew stood up, picking up the wine bottle casually. His voice was measured, almost detached. "Emily came by to visit me and the kids. We were just catching up." "Visiting you and the kids?" Victoria echoed, her voice sharper now. Her gaze darted between Andrew and Emily, searching for some hidden truth. "It seems like I've missed quite a bit." Andrew met her eyes with a steady gaze, his expression devoid of the softness she once knew. "You've missed a lot, Vicky, but I don't blame you. That was your choice." His words, though spoken without malice, sliced through her pride like a blade. She turned to Emily, intending to say something biting, but Emily only took another sip of her wine, unfazed by the tension. "So, what are you two now?" Victoria asked, her voice trembling as she tried to mask her rising panic. Andrew set his glass down, clasping his hands together on the table. "She's a friend," he said firmly, "but at least she understands me, which is more than I can say for you." A surge of anger flared up within Victoria, but it was quickly overtaken by a sense of helplessness. When had Andrew, the man who once adored her, started looking at her as if she were a stranger? And when had another woman found her way into the spaces that once belonged solely to her? "So this is your revenge?" she snapped, her voice no longer steady. "You bring her into our house, let her meet our children, knowing full well how I'd feel?" Andrew frowned, his expression hardening. "This isn't revenge, Vicky. This is reality. You're the one who wanted to open the door to other people in our marriage. Don't expect me to sit idly by while you have your freedom." Emily stood, reaching for her bag. "I think I should go," she said softly, her tone tinged with polite regret but free of guilt. "Andrew, thank you for the evening. I'll see you and the kids another time." The sound of the door clicking shut behind Emily left an oppressive silence between Victoria and Andrew. She stared at him, her eyes red and brimming with unshed tears. "You've changed," she whispered. Andrew let out a bitter chuckle. "Yes, I've changed. Because you forced me to. We can fix this, Andrew." She stepped closer, her hands trembling as she reached for his arm, but he took a step back, keeping the distance between them. "I don't want to lose you." Andrew sighed, turning away, his gaze fixed out the window as though he were searching for answers beyond the darkened glass. "Vicky, I think you lost me the night you asked for an open marriage." That's when I realized you no longer valued me the way you once did." It felt as though the ground beneath her had crumbled. For the first time, Victoria saw the truth in his eyes. Andrew had changed, and this time, he wouldn't be coming back. Later that night, Victoria stood before the large mirror in their bedroom. The pale light filtering in from outside illuminated the reflection of a woman with swollen eyes and a gaunt face. It was her, and yet it wasn't. The woman in the mirror looked like a shadow of the person Andrew had once loved, the woman who had helped him build a life and a family. She didn't know when she had lost herself like this, but the path she had chosen had undeniably led to this inescapable outcome. The house was quieter than ever. Andrew had moved in with Emily, and her 2 children, though still physically present at times, felt more distant than ever before. Zara, her eldest, barely spoke to her, maintaining a polite but icy demeanor that cut deeper than any argument could. Matthew, her youngest, tried to be kind, but his sad, searching eyes told a different story. Victoria knew. She was the reason for the cracks that had splintered their family. When Andrew proposed the divorce, she had already sensed the inevitability of it, even before he spoke. He sat across from her, his eyes free of anger or resentment, replaced only by a calmness that was almost unbearable. "Victoria," he began, his voice soft but resolute, "we've reached the end of the road. You know it, and so do I. I don't hate you anymore, but I can't live in pretense for another day." She didn't cry, not at first. She simply sat in silence, her heart tightening with every word. When he slid the divorce papers across the table, the weight of the moment finally hit her, as though the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. "Andrew," she whispered, searching his face for some flicker of hesitation, some trace of doubt. But all she saw was quiet acceptance. He signed the papers and handed her the pen. "You can sign when you're ready," he said, his tone devoid of malice but firm. "But I hope you understand. This isn't just for me. It's for the kids. They need stability, even if that no longer includes both of us together." She nodded, unable to find the words to respond, her throat constricted by the weight of her emotions. She felt her world collapsing in slow motion. In the days that followed, Victoria tried to rebuild bridges with her children. She showed up at Matthew's soccer games, cheering from the sidelines even as he responded to her with curt, detached answers. She made attempts to talk to Zara, but her daughter's response was a dagger to her already fragile heart. "Do you think just showing up will fix everything?" Zara said coldly, her eyes blazing with hurt. "You destroyed this family." Those words stung more than anything Andrew had ever said to her. They were the unvarnished truth, and there was no escaping it. One evening, alone in the quiet, empty house, Victoria stumbled upon an old photograph. In it, Andrew was giving Zara a piggyback ride, his face lit up with the joy she hadn't seen in years. Matthew was perched on Victoria's shoulders, his tiny hands reaching for the sky as if grasping for the stars. She stared at the image, tears slipping down her cheeks as waves of regret crashed over her. Those happy days were gone, reduced to distant memories. She had let Cassie's words and her own selfish desires destroy everything. But that night she made a decision. She couldn't keep living as the shadow of her former self. She couldn't change the past, but she could try to salvage the present and build something new from the wreckage. Victoria resolved to rebuild her life. She returned to the career she had abandoned years ago, diving back into interior design. The road was far from easy. Long hours, late nights, and countless self-doubts haunted her. But for the first time in years, she had a purpose. Slowly, she began to see herself as more than just a failed wife or a distant mother. She was a woman trying to rise again. Over time, her efforts bore small but meaningful results. One evening, as she sketched designs in the living room, Matthew walked in with a mug of tea in his hands. Setting it gently on the table, he looked at her with quiet but sincere eyes. "I see you're trying, Mom," he said softly. "I think maybe you deserve a second chance." His words were like a beam of light piercing through the dark fog of her life. Victoria knew Zara's forgiveness wouldn't come easily, but she resolved to keep trying day by day, moment by moment. Years later, as Victoria scrolled through her social media feed, she came across a photo of Andrew and Emily with their child. In the picture, they looked radiant and at peace, surrounded by warmth and happiness. Victoria didn't feel the familiar pang of jealousy or sorrow. Instead, she smiled faintly, saving the photo as a quiet gesture of acceptance. Andrew deserved this happiness, and perhaps so did Emily. And for the first time, Victoria felt like she too deserved the peace she was beginning to find within herself. Victoria had finally learned the most valuable lesson of all. Love is not just about demands, it's about sacrifice and gratitude. She had lost sight of that once, but now she knew she wouldn't let herself forget it again. Not with her family, her career, or even with herself. Her story wasn't one of perfect closure, but it was a new beginning, filled with hope and hard-earned wisdom.